We have quite a full agenda today. So I think I'm going to at least just get started with an agenda overview and some logistics, and we'll continue to welcome people in. Hello, everybody. I am Jill Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director for the White River Alliance. The Alliance is a multi-stakeholder organization who, among our many programs that we offer both regionally and statewide, we also host the Indiana Water Summit. And as part of that effort, we try to convene conversations across disciplines and across different government sectors, as well as different water user sectors. And when we do that, we get a pretty full agenda at the summit. So sometimes some of our topics warrant a little further investigation and more time. So then we host forums like this one. So last year, we hosted forums on wetlands and on the up and coming emerging contaminant issue around PFASs. So we've been doing these forums in conjunction with Purdue's Center for the Environment. So I just give a shout out to Purdue for joining us and making great researchers available to help us ensure that we have science guiding these forums and that we can then push into some policy discussions and some solutions. So today we have some good university researchers with us, as well as consultants that help us come up with solutions to these challenges. So excited to have everybody here. Thank you for your interest. As a reminder, this year's Water Summit is September 7th and 8th. Also, as a reminder, it would be great if you guys could keep yourself muted through this forum. We will have 2 opportunities for Q&A, and we will use the chat to do that. So if things pop into your mind as we go through and hear from our speakers today, please just insert your questions into chat. We'll be picking them up from there, and I will try to feed those to our speakers during the question and answer session. So if we get overwhelmed with questions, I'm certain that this group of speakers will happily follow up after the forum, and we can send out a Q&A document if necessary then. So just a reminder on that. The last reminder I have for you is if you're joining us and you're interested in PDHs or CEUs of some sort, we certainly can help facilitate that by providing agendas or in some cases certificates. So if we have engineers on this call looking for PDHs, Brian Nielsen, who's a long-term Alliance board member, has agreed to facilitate some of that. And we are going to drop his email in the chat for you at the beginning and at the end. So if you need those, please contact Brian. And we are happy to have a partnership with the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District, who's a technical provider, in order to help ensure that those PDHs are met. So with that, I'm going to try to stop talking and turn this over, as we have a lot of great information to share with you. Flooding is a wildly important topic in regard to water management. And so we're excited to have this group of speakers here today. And so to kick us off, we are going to take a look at the current state of floodplain mapping. There's been a lot of discussion about this as a suite of additional maps came out a couple of years ago. So we wanted to make sure we had the latest and greatest knowledge from our partners at DNR. So with that, I'm going to welcome Dave Knight to join us as our first speaker. And thank you, Dave, for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. The share going.
Looking pretty good. Thanks, Dave.
Right, we good?
Yep, you're perfect. All right, I'm going to mute myself. Hand it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity again. My name's Dave Knight. I am the director of the Indiana DNR Division of Water. And before becoming director, I was managing the floodplain mapping program for the state of Indiana for DNR. So what I want to do today is just go over some quick basics on what floodplain mapping is and how it's created and some of the things that kind of swirl around it and how we at DNR are very much involved with this. So here's some just 101 on floodplain mapping. So typically you've heard of what's called a flood insurance rate map, and that is the map that is created on behalf of the National Flood Insurance Program by FEMA. So typically when folks are looking at floodplain maps or talking about floodplain maps, they're really talking about this FIRM map. That map depicts what's called the regulatory floodplain The 1% annual chance, you'll hear it called the 100-year flood. We always hate that term, but it's permeated into the consciousness of everyone, so it's still out there. And then the 0.2% chance flood, which is the 500-year, and the floodway, which is really key for us. FEMA typically mandates that each community be evaluated, their firms and their firm needs be evaluated every 5 years. However, that isn't practical with funding levels and such, so it takes 20, 30 years to actually get through a map revision or a map update through FEMA, and we'll go into how that works. But to enhance that, and because that's such a long time frame, we've created in DNR what's called the Indiana Best Available Floodplain Mapping, which gives us more comprehensive coverage of flood zones than what you find in the firms. So just as a reaction of trying to slog through the FEMA mapping process, we wanted to have something a little more dynamic. We'll go through that. So just real quick, if you're not familiar with how floodplains and floodways work, this is the very general diagram that we have. So very roughly, the 100-year floodplain is broken into two different distinct zones. One is the floodway, which includes the stream channel and any overbank areas that are required to convey flood flow. Outside of that floodway, you have the flood fringe area, which is the area of more stagnant water or storage. And I know Sivash and Bob will talk more about the relationships between the two and how they impact it. But the key takeaway for our purposes at DNR is that the floodway defines our jurisdiction with respect to the Flood Control Act. So just a little bit on flood zones. This screen capture is just from the NFHL viewer. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you'll hear us talk about in the FEMA world, zone A's versus zone X's. So zone A's are the regulatory floodplain, that 1% annual chance floodplain, and whether that's an A or an AE, a zone A is a more undefined zone. Typically on a FEMA map that will not have a model-backed or an engineering-backed source to it. It might, but sometimes it doesn't. And then the detailed studies that you see will have both the zone AE, which is the more detailed information, and then the floodway actually delineated on it. So there's a distinction between that zone A and that zone AE. And it's something that we'll get into here as we go, but it's a pretty important distinction between the two flood zones. However, the mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance is enforced in any zone that is an A. Outside of that, it's called zone X. The shaded zone X, the orange areas on the map are the 500-year zones, and anything outside of that is called just zone X. So you'll hear those terms thrown around, that's what they mean. So going back a little bit, when the NFIP started in 1968, the FEMA created some first maps to get information out. These are Zipatone maps from back in the 70s that are really based on 7.5-minute quadrangles, soils maps, very limited engineering that's gone into these. And they're typically called dot maps. So they're pretty coarse scale. And the issue that you get into with these is that information has kind of been pushed forward and forward and forward through the years. And a lot of that has not been revised since the 70s, even though the map dates do change, but a lot of that information has just been lifted and placed into new mapping. So that's something that we've wanted to address. One way we do address it is DNR, from the inception of the NFIP, we've been the state coordinating agency for the National Flood Insurance Program. So we work very closely with FEMA on insurance questions and making sure communities have the ordinances they need in place to be members of the National Flood Insurance Program. But additionally, we have become what's called a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. And that is a program where FEMA basically funds our agency to create the flood insurance rate maps. DNR, since the implementation of the CTP program in 2004, we've created about 90% of the mapping that you see in FEMA maps has actually come out of our office. And that will actually probably increase in the future as we take on even more. Like I said, we've been doing that since 2004. We've partnered with the Polis Center to do a lot of our mapping, the actual mapping GIS work. And then the Polis Center, we have been doing that for a while, and then they became their own CTP in 2018. And so we've got a really good partnership. We've been funded, I don't even, it's got to be in the $15 to $20 million range over that time to upgrade floodplain mapping throughout the state. So one of the big things we did in 2004 was starting the map modernization process, where we took a lot of the old paper maps and got them into a GIS format and a digital format, so that we can do more with digital information and pushing that forward, and also getting them onto a good base map, which we didn't have back in the 70s. So a lot of the technology improvements has really been a game changer in terms of updating and upgrading floodplain mapping and getting more accurate information out there. So after we finished the map modernization, upgrading all the maps for the state, FEMA stepped back and wanted to do take another tack with the floodplain mapping program, and introduced what's called risk map. And we're really in the risk map portion today, but the idea behind risk map is that not only would we update maps and update floodplain information, but we would also spend some time looking at communication of risk, and sorry about that, and also mitigation of risk. So looking at mitigative measures, and Sheila in her presentation at the end will talk about some of the risk map initiatives that we've been doing outside of the actual mapping, and how those actually merge together. So we spent a good part of the early 2010s doing a lot of this work. And then in 2018, we started again with another round of data development. And a lot of that has actually been focused on the White River Basin. So another key thing, I'll just touch on this. I'm sure everyone is fairly familiar with the LiDAR collections that we've done. We are up to, we've actually have two complete collections of the state, one stopping in 2013, the second one in 2020. We're talking about a third one that we might crank up in a year or two. But the key thing with LiDAR is just a real game changer in terms of creating floodplain mapping with that detailed elevation information. That's the key piece to actually creating accurate and worthwhile floodplain mapping. Excuse me. So we talked about map modernization and the working with FEMA to upgrade maps. However, we also had another funding source that we wanted to use to upgrade all of the Zone A's within the state. And that was through the Office of Community and Rural Affairs. It's actually a HUD grant that we got based on the 2008 flooding disaster. And with that, we were able to do some automated methods or semi-automated methods to create floodplains and floodways. And we actually, over a period of about 3 or 4 years, mapped 18,500 miles of streams. So everything basically outside of the FEMA detailed studies we picked up with this project. So what that gives us is model-backed flood zones pretty much for the entire state. We don't quite have everything. We're probably about 85% coverage, but we certainly have all the major streams covered, and a lot of the what's left over are smaller, tiny, mile reaches of things here and there that were just not economical for us to pick up. So with that, there's two very basic sources for floodplain mapping. The FEMA version is the National Flood Hazard Layer, the NFHL, you'll hear it called. And that represents what's published in the flood insurance rate maps. And it's used for insurance purposes, not for ratings insurance so much these days, but for determining that mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. People are required to use this National Flood Hazard Layer. Our version of this is called the Best Available Floodplain Layer. So it includes those detailed studies that FEMA has in the NFHL, but also enhances those with our Zone A work. So it's a much more comprehensive data set. It has floodway delineated throughout the entire state so that we have a good picture of where our jurisdiction lies in terms of the Flood Control Act. And it is, as I said, pretty much comprehensive. Here's just a comparison of the NFHL and the best available layer. And you can see the differences in the more comprehensive coverage in the best available layer. Basically, we map up to the square mile drainage area everywhere we can. And so we have been using the best available as our regulatory product. We have been throughout the past set up through the Flood Control Act and the associated rules with it, which you'll see here, that give us the guidance and the authority for us to use this mapping as our regulatory map for the Flood Control Act. So 44 CFR is the FEMA regulations, which give us FEMA's blessing on using the best available data layer. The Indiana Model Floodplain Ordinance was also blessed by FEMA, also directs us to use the best available data. That's why we call it the best available floodplain layers, because that's the language that's in 44 CFR and the floodplain ordinances and the floodplain ordinance language. And then 312 IAC, which are the floodplain management rules, go into the details of each of the mapping pieces that are covered by what we do. And with that, we also, in the last session, part of House Bill 1103, passed a new piece of code that actually incorporates that concept that the best available floodplain mapping data needs to be used by local floodplain administrators into actual code. This was in response to a couple of things. One, we had a few folks that were confused between the FEMA maps and the DNR maps and the best available maps. And so we had some issues with folks not using those correctly. So we wanted to make sure that was clear in statute. And then last but not least, all this information is on the Indiana Floodplain Information Portal, INFIP, infip.dnr.in.gov. We just very recently revamped this and rolled out version 2.0. And in this, one real key piece of it is that you can get a fairly comprehensive report that is what we call our floodplain analysis and regulatory assessment report, our FAIR reports, automatically through this portal. In the past, we had been doing those by hand. And so that was a great time-saving thing for our staff so that we can free our staff up to do the other things that we need to do. So I encourage everyone to check that out and give us feedback if you take a look at things. But with that, that is my time. So I will pass this off to the next presenters.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. It's nice to see all the new resources and maps, DNR staying current, and I actually learned some new acronyms. I mean, INFIP 2.0, that's pretty cool to know about. All right, we're going to keep moving along here. Our next speakers on part one of our agenda today are looking at the future trends and current mitigation measures surrounding flooding. Two of my favorite dynamic duo speakers together, Bob Barr from IUPUI Center for Earth and Environmental Science and Siavash Baik from Christopher Burke Engineering. Those of you in the flood world, I know you've probably seen and heard from these folks before. It is important to find ways to succinctly talk about the large challenges that we're having in regard to flooding with climate shifts and other development trends. So Siavash and Bob, I'm really glad and grateful to have you guys here today. Bob, I appreciated learning so much from you at the Wetlands Task Force about where we are in regard to flood risks. So with that, welcome, gentlemen, and the time is yours.
Thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk with a group like this, to follow Dave, who's given us a nice overview of the many tools that Indiana has available to help us better understand flooding. And I'm going to pick that up a little bit and talk about why we are having such an interest in flooding and the problems that we're seeing as a result of that flooding. And then Siavash is going to come in and do the heavy lifting and talk about what we might be able to do about some of these problems. So as we look at this, and we tried to get our page down to work. Pardon me, we practiced all of this just before we started. Okay, so many of you have seen me use this slide in the past. And when we think about flooding today, I really have to start here. On the left-hand side, you see observed trends in heavy precipitation in a decadal mode. So looking at decades from the 1900s to the 2000s, and you see a stark increase at the end of the 20th century. As we start getting into the 21st century, we start seeing this continued increase in flooding. And each decade it's increased. But what's significant about this picture as we think about flood hazards is to look and see that in the past, during these lower periods of precipitation, when precipitation was slightly different, is when a lot of our infrastructure was put in, and not just our urban stormwater, but also our agricultural infrastructure. And as you drive across the fields today or tomorrow and you look around, you're going to see field tile going in all across the state. And that's going in response to the rainfall that we've been getting, the increase in rainfall. The right-hand side shows another image that we use frequently, and this is the heaviest 1% of events, and it shows the strong increase, this 42% increase in the central part of the Midwest. Again, driving flood peaks up in this whole area through here. This is a map put together in the 2014 Global Change Report that tries to take those decadal changes that we were just looking at and put them on a map showing the increase in flooding, what we're going to see in magnitude of flooding over the coming decades from now through 2050. And if you look at where Indiana is, and hopefully you can see my cursor a little bit here, you can see that we're in this 10% range. So we're going to see another 10% predicted increase in flood magnitude for each decade between now and 2050, we believe, which if you start putting the numbers together is a significant increase by the time we get to 2050. That changing dynamic of flooding that we're seeing across the region is mimicked here in the state. And if we look at what's happening in the state, it again, like I said, mirrors what we're seeing on this larger national perspective. Here you see the increase on the left-hand side. You can see the increase in precipitation across the state. You can see the differences and the variations in it. We're going from about 8 inches in the southern part of the state to a low of about 4.2 in the Northeast. So we have variability in this, but we also have a variability in the landscape and how this precipitation is moving across the landscape in different parts of the state. What's significant is also the seasonal change. We're getting more of this in the winter and the spring. That trend is going to continue. And as you look at this map, you'll see a strong increase really kicking up and a change in slope as you get to about 1978 through present. And we see no indication that this is going to change. You've seen us use this slide as well, extreme events. So not only are we getting more rain on the landscape, we're getting more heavy rain on the landscape. Again, in this winter, coming into spring has been a good example of this. We've gotten several 2-inch rains in 24 hours, several 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, and those were coming in since January on sometimes a landscape that was frozen, increasing the runoff and the potential for flooding. We can integrate what's happening with the precipitation, so the amount of rainfall coming in, the amount of snow melting, with what we do in response to that when we look at these hydrographs, these records and graphs of discharge at a point on a river where we see how much water is moving past, because we're responding, as I said, with the field tile example earlier, we're responding to the change in precipitation. We increase drainage. We increase drainage, we increase runoff. And as a result of that, these flood peaks just continue to increase. This is one from Hart Ditch in northwestern Indiana. And for the period of record, you're seeing a 45% increase in peak discharge. Think about this in relationship now to what I said earlier about magnitude increasing another 10%. This is going to continue to increase. So 45% becomes 55, 65, 75, and we're dealing with an entirely different system. To show you the sort of the regional perspective of this, this is now Blue River near White Cloud, all the way down in south central Indiana. And here we're seeing a 30% increase in peak stream flow. So high increases across the state. We have seen numbers anywhere from about 25 to 30% increase all the way to 50 on some portions of the Iroquois. So substantial increases in stream flow requiring us to think about how we're going to manage this. And unfortunately, we're going to try to manage it with a much depleted natural infrastructure. Wetlands are storage. Wetlands hold water. And as this slide tries to show you, we've lost most of our wetlands. Depending on who's counting, we've lost between 85 and 95% of our wetlands. And that loss continues. We continue to lose wetlands, even though we try to mitigate for their loss. But look at the numbers, I think are striking. You know, we've gone from over 5 million acres down to 813,000, and that's a best guess. All of that was potential storage. Now, this is not to say that we're ever going to put it all back or that we would need to put it all back. But we've reached the point where we have the luxury to start thinking about how much do we have to put back in to start improving things. Another example of the same thing, you can see the top figure is from some work that Dahl did back in the late 80s and into the 1990s, showing that Indiana is one of a group of 6 states that have lost over 95% of their wetlands. And the figure below it, artificially drained agricultural land, tries to show you that most of that was lost as agricultural modification. It's no surprise to anybody, but it's an indicator of where we need to start thinking about managing some of these floodwaters. Now, our other major point of storage has been floodplains, and unfortunately, it's been more difficult for us to quantify what's happening in floodplains. How many floodplains are now still functioning? Fortunately, Ian Hahus at Burke has been doing some really good work and has come up with some connectivity tools to let us look at how connected that floodplain is to the river or the stream. This is an example from Little River. And you can see the main stem Little River marked with red dots going across the page or the slide. Each one of those red dots represents an area where even at 2 times the level it should flood, it still isn't able to get out of the channel. So all of the water in this river is, for the most part, confined to that channel except during extreme events. which means that this water is piled up deeper and faster than it would be. And if you'll notice in the left-hand image, this section is 6 miles long, is sitting right above Huntington, Indiana. This is not the place where we want to pile it up and move it along faster. You can also see in this same image wetland loss. The big solid color wetland areas are this big solid colored blue areas are areas where we've lost wetlands. And in this area, there's a brighter side to this story, because this is a map of potential hydric soil. And then again, you'll see the little river traced out with the dots, but everything in dark blue on here is potentially hydric or wetland. So we got a chance to put wetlands back in and make this system function a little bit better. And the Little River Wetlands Project has been doing just that in the headwaters for a number of years. We've got a lot of work to do, and these tools will help us manage it. But the more storage we lose, the more runoff is going to increase. And the numbers don't look good. Less than 25% of the Little River is connected to the floodplain at the elevation or stage that it should be connected. So more water faster than ever before, and more erosion. Fortunately, Sea of Ash has some solutions maybe. Thank you. Sea of Ash.
Thank you. And it's good to be here. It's a pleasure, and trying to get the screens here. Hopefully everybody sees my screen. Thanks, Bob. And as Dave talked to us, of course, we have good, readily available flood risk data is now accessible very easily, and that's fantastic. However, we also need to have strategies to reduce the flood risk. Not by themselves, a good component of that, but by themselves not going to do that. So I thought maybe give a brief overview of our current status of what we see basically in terms of the state of current framework that we have. The IDNR regulates the floodway, and so as such, we are within the floodway, we are looking at the capacity, and so permitting that thing. However, we're also only looking at a 100-year flood at that time, and that becomes significant when our flows are changing, and our 100-year in the future may not be the same amount right now. And so we may have impacts or so smaller or larger floods that we are not measuring perhaps. The current regulations also allow filling of areas outside the floodway without any compensation. Many people don't realize that, but that just, there's nothing there to keep people from filling these areas outside the floodways. Though we have regulations, state regulations that is permitted through the locals that says that you need to build safer and build 2 feet higher than BFE, which is great because the buildings are safer. But what is not changing is that fill, which is being placed in the floodplain, and thus the storage is taken. And of course, with the 2 feet higher, we also taking more storage away because this 2 feet higher is accomplished by putting fill. Of course, we can avoid all that if we are able, our local governments, which regulate land use, could prohibit development totally in the floodplain. It's something we'll talk about later. But the minimum, bottom line of this is that minimum federal and state regulatory strategies do not preserve floodplain storage or other beneficial functions of the floodplain. And that's the concern. The current framework is not adequate, especially when we look at the climate change that Bob talked about. Now we have done detailed studies that show that the loss of this flood fringe storage areas could cause significant increase in flood discharge in stages. On the lower left, you see a picture of basically a floodplain on Hawk Creek along in the Columbus area. In 2008, there was major flooding in Columbus, and we did a study and say, well, if the flood fringe areas were filled, like they're allowed to be filled, what would happen? And unfortunately, our results show that we will have anywhere between half a foot to more than 1.5 foot of flood stage increases along the stream as a result of that type of a filling. So that definitely is an issue that cumulatively would work over time. We are also seeing an increase in flood stages, even for the same discharges. You've seen some of these graphs before, and we attribute that to perhaps encroachments in the floodplain and also filling in the floodplain, and sometimes reduction of cross-sectional area due to sedimentation, which is all caused by us. And finally, we are witnessing this increased stream bank erosion, significant erosion along our streams, that becoming worse and worse. And this is just a talk by itself, and Bob would be happy to give you that. But that's, basically is mostly caused by this increased impactful discharges and detached floodplains, the floodplain that are detached that Bob talked about. And the increase in backflow discharges is because we are either uncompensated or undercompensated of the impact of development. And by development, I mean urban development and agricultural development in terms of intensification of the drainage. So bottom line, and you've seen this one, of course, science hasn't changed since I last spoke, and our evidence hasn't changed. The flooding is getting worse and erosion is getting worse due to several factors. Rainfall is one of them, but also the watershed land use changes, the loss of wetlands and floodplains that Bob talked about. All of these are human-induced, so we can do something about it. Despite current state floodway regulations and local peak flow detention requirements, we're still seeing higher flood stages. We are seeing stream bank erosion, and channel maintenance costs are rising every day. So that's another proof that this minimum standards that the federal state is not protecting us. And that's where we turn into the local governments, counties and cities that have the land use basically authority, and they may be able to do something. The last bullet here is of interest maybe many of you. We are designing our infrastructure right now based on the flows that we see today, rainfall data and flow that we see today versus what may be at the end of the project life. So many of this infrastructure that are designed based on current guidelines are already soon will become deficient, and that's very alarming to us. So what can we do about all this? And really globally and nationally, this is a question that is faced by communities. Flows are increasing. We are seeing higher floods. We're seeing all that. What are our choices? Really, basically, we have three choices, and those three choices are either mitigate and modify the flooding source through major structural projects. These are like levees. There are big flood control facilities, diversions, bypasses, things like that. Multi-million-dollar projects. Second choice is to understand the flooding is going to increase, and we don't have in our toolbox that kind of available funding or to do the major projects, and so we adapt to the situation and become resilient through smart growth practices. And the third one is to do neither, do nothing, and continue with status quo. And of course, the consequence of that is just to suffer, continue suffering and something. So let me just briefly talk about some of these choices and go forward with that. The first one was this major, basically mitigation projects. That involves securing major funding, allocating and spending, the funds necessary to try to reduce the flooding So through major structural projects, as I said, diversion, flood control, levees, things like that. And so I put in some advantages, disadvantages down here, but I don't really intend to go on them. Just to talking about that definitely in terms of advantages, obviously, this type of projects would reduce the flooding, obviously, to the design level. So anything larger than design level, they are not designed for. And they have minimal disruption. But there are several disadvantages to this thing. First of all, they are not always technically feasible. For instance, levees, you may not have the time in tiebacks to have a high ground, as an example, or may not have enough land to do a major flood control reservoir. They're very, very costly. They're hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the local governments or state may not be able to do it by themselves. You need congressional help, federal control over the facilities. And coming back off of those monies are not easy. Maybe out of the 1,000 projects that people suggest for this major things, 1 or 2 gets funded. And you have to be patient to do it. And one of our speakers today is going to talk about the luck they had in a place like Louisiana. Of course, you know what happened in Louisiana. So you need to do that one. So I hate for people to just pin all their chances to just this kind of projects, because they are very hard to come by. And also, this last thing is that these kind of projects are very sensitive to climate change impacts. As flow increasing, the design level that the thing was designed for could be overtaken. The second choice to adopt unavoidable, go to the resilience and looking at adaptation. That one here, and this one also has several advantages and disadvantages, but definitely decisions are made locally without the need to rely on federal timelines or red tapes. You can start those anytime. There's a shorter realization time frame for these type of projects. And so things that can be done right now, and they're not that sensitive to climate change impacts. They're permanent solutions. Of course, there are disadvantages, and it needs hard political decisions to be made, and stakeholder engagement sometimes becomes difficult. And the last thing is the status quo, and of course, if you take that route, you don't have to spend any money, so you can do everything too much, but the flood vulnerabilities are continue increasing, and you will continue frequent disasters that could have backlash and legal liability to communities. The path that we suggest to go forward, the only path which is really available to most communities, is to adapt and be resilient. And that has a two-pronged approach of preventing things from getting worse, and then adopting strategies to reduce the, basically to protect the buildings. And in terms of getting things from worse, preserving the existing wetlands and upland depressional storage, preserving remaining undeveloped floodplains, and FEH corridors and floodways are essential. And so is to have no adverse impact development standards, which you see the LTAP has already produced those. And then finally, adopting those area-specific flood resilience strategies we have talked about several times, so I don't want to go over, kind of go over this in detail, but basically looking at dividing the community into small zones and having strategies for each zone, with the most important one to preserve the floodplains. The last slide, just to, and the bottom line is that studies have shown, once and several times, that one of the most effective strategies to reducing the risk is to avoid placing people in infrastructure in vulnerable locations. So there's 3 things we need to be doing: is preventing increasing vulnerability. That's through smart growth, through new development to the safer areas, and have no adverse relation to watersheds, no more wetland and floodplain lots. Preparing for the next flood, like accepting the flood is going to happen. What do we do to reduce the pain and suffering? And finally, protecting the buildings and infrastructure, and in that order. And if some of you think that you have seen this message before, you're not dreaming. We are trying to say this over and over And I'm hoping that it's fine because nothing has changed on those things. Thank you for your attention, and we'll just be available to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Bob and Siavash. I never know whether to be depressed or hopeful after I get through these things with you guys, but sounds like we have some expensive solutions that are hard, and we have some political solutions that are hard, or we can suffer. So I think we're excited to move to the second part of our agenda here pretty quickly and focus on some of those solutions. But before we do so, I wanted to make sure we had one question about the maps, and I want to get that in before Dave needs to leave. Unfortunately, Dave Knipe has to hop off at 1. So Dave, there was a question that came up about the 100-year and 500-year floods being revised as part of the floodway and floodplains. Are we still using old definitions of those things? How do those definitions relate to the new maps? We take that one question and then we'll maybe push the others toward the end.
Right. So yes, at the moment we are using, I won't say older definitions, but older data and flood data and rainfall data that doesn't quite reflect new thinking on climate change effects and such. It's just, it takes a while for the science to catch up in order to adequately define what those changes would be. That process is starting to happen. The thing I'm jumping off at 1 o'clock just to see is a NOAA presentation on what they're planning to work on for looking at that piece. So the actual definition of the 100-year flood, I would not think would change. What will change is the way that it's actually determined and calculated.
Okay, thanks for that. I was scrolling the chat and it looked like there was a question about the Mississippi through Louisiana, and what's happens to be serendipitous is David Johnson's going to talk to us a little bit about Louisiana here in part 2. So I'm going to let that one ride a little bit and keep us on track. If we stay on track, we will have plenty of time at the end for a 15-minute Q&A, which should get it all in. So with that, I'd like to welcome David Johnson, who's joining us from Purdue Center for the Environment, who's going to talk to us and shift us into our part of the forum where we focus on community planning and resilience, which was one of Siavash's set of solutions. And David's going to talk to us about flood risks, impacts, and resiliency planning, some lessons learned from Louisiana. And then after that, Sheila will join us. So I will do that introduction when you're done here, David. And with that, please welcome David Johnson.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just pull up my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what Louisiana has done since 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. What you're seeing here is in New Orleans. This is the outfall canal from one of the largest drainage pump systems in the world that was built after Katrina, in order to try and prevent that sort of disaster from happening again. So as many of us know, Katrina hit in 2005 and radically reshaped a lot of Gulf communities. I only mention some of these contributors here because I want to focus on how they've overcome those. I think a lot of us know about Katrina itself and what happened in New Orleans and the rest of the Gulf. But what I really focus on is what they've done since then. So leading up to 2005, they had a lot of different projects that had been proposed over the decades for flood protection, but they were spread out across the coast and always evaluated independently without a systems view of what the entire coast would look like with a portfolio of solutions in place. And different parts of the coast that have different goals, different economies, some parts that are more focused on fisheries, some that are more focused on petrochemical extraction, oil and gas, were at odds with one another in preventing collective action. And so I want to talk about how they've developed that collective action since then. And this really kind of comes down to the old adage that you never let a good disaster go to waste. So since 2005, the state developed a new state agency, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, that is in charge of developing and maintaining this comprehensive master plan for a sustainable coast. You can see the 2007, 2012, and 2017 plans. Now it's being updated every 6 years. So we are in the midst of model runs for the 2023 update that is really based on the state of the art in terms of science and engineering for flood risk modeling. I'm involved in doing the flood modeling for the state as part of the master plan, as well as some other statewide initiatives that have moved these lessons in the coastal zone through the entire state. So they take a very integrated approach to both protection and coastal restoration, which those are their two primary objectives for this plan. But they also consider a whole host of other factors, some of which have been mentioned as being relevant in Indiana in the previous presentations. But they're looking not just at preventing land loss from sea level rise and erosion, not just protecting against flooding, but also making sure that rivers remain navigable for commerce, fisheries can be supported, that habitat is available for a whole host of different species, as well as protecting things like critical infrastructure, historic and strategic properties, and other things like that. So they have this holistic view of all of these different factors that need to be considered in order to develop an integrated plan that doesn't just focus on flood protection, but focuses on projects like barrier island restoration, marsh creation, river diversions, which both rebuild the landscape and also have secondary impacts on flood risk themselves. But they're looking at those types of green solutions in addition to your standard structural solutions like levees and flood walls. And they also dedicate $6 billion out of the current $50 billion plan towards non-structural solutions. Those are, elevating people's houses, flood-proofing businesses and industry, and relocations in some high-risk areas. So they are talking about strategic use of buyouts and relocation as well in order to adapt. So this plan is a 50-year plan on an iterative cycle where we update it pretty much continuously. I'll talk about what that planning cycle looks like briefly coming up, but I do want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions to people to ask about the process. But what you see here is a map of where projects are located for the 2017 version of the Coastal Master Plan. And you can see that things are spread out across the entire coast. It's not just focused on New Orleans here in the eastern part of the map, but we didn't put our finger on the scale in any sort of way in order to develop this whole coast-wide suite of solutions. It just naturally turns out that if you're considering these wide range of objectives and a wide range of different policy options and infrastructure projects in order to manage the coast, that there's value associated with the entire coast and protecting or restoring it accordingly. So you don't have to take a certain amount of money for each county in Indiana or the parishes in Louisiana. It just naturally has kind of fallen out that there is value in spreading things out. So in order to actually do all of this, it takes a lot of interagency coordination. Like I said, the state established this new agency that is specifically designed to maintain this coastal master plan and to manage coordination across the entire coastal zone. I apologize, I know this figure is a little bit fuzzy, but this is showing that CPRA is working with transportation, with Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife and Fisheries, Department of Environmental Quality, Homeland Security, and a whole range of different agencies in the state that all contribute their best science and engineering knowledge to CPRA in order to evaluate projects that have been proposed for this plan. So the interagency coordination is absolutely essential when we have these diverse objectives that we're trying to meet and to maximize planning capacity. The modeling itself is also highly integrated. We have predictive models that start with landscape morphology of understanding how the landscape is going to change over the next 50 years with different assumptions about sea level rise, different assumptions about the frequency and intensity of rainfall and tropical cyclones impacting storm surge. And so the modeling suite starts with assumptions about what's going to happen in the next 50 years and takes it all the way through how that's going to reshape the landscape, how it's going to reshape vegetation as saltwater intrudes into fresh or brackish wetlands and changes vegetation species and wildlife habitat, and then how that is going to then impact flood risk. Projects are evaluated independently, but then also selected as part of a portfolio where projects that are high performing are competed against each other in order to understand how that total $50 billion budget should be allocated. And it does account for unintended consequences, whether those are positive or negative. So we do also attribute some flood risk benefits to things like the wetland restoration projects. Another key message here is that co-production and just constant communication with stakeholders is essential to this type of process. So Sivash mentioned in the disadvantages of the adaptation option, the extensive stakeholder engagement that's required in order to adapt. And I think that is true. It's essential in order for a plan like this to be successful. I mentioned the $50 billion price tag here. It has passed through the Louisiana legislature now 3 times, unanimously every time. And there is nothing in American politics with a $50 billion price tag that is unanimous, except for this, that I can think of. If anyone else is aware of something else that large that has unanimous support, I would love to know. But the thing here is that there are still winners and losers. Despite projects being spread out across the entire coast, there are still some communities where in Louisiana, there's not a whole lot that we can do. There's not a way to engineer ourselves a solution. There are some communities that are just going to face increased risk going forward to the point where they may not be viable. And so that's where these relocation options come into play as well and into the conversation. So despite there being winners and losers, everyone supports the plan because they know that it is based on the best available science and that there has been a thoughtful, continuous stream of communication with stakeholders and local governments and other NGOs to understand that this is the best that the state is able to do and that they are trying their best to balance trade-offs across these multiple objectives and reach a compromise that everyone can agree with. The process, as I mentioned, has gone through 3 planning cycles. We're on the 4th now. And so we have this iterative process where some of the text here I know may be a little bit small for people depending on their monitors, but the key point here is that stakeholder engagement informs every part of this process, you know, the text in black there in the middle. And then what we learn from each of those steps goes back into the knowledge base that we can draw on in the next iteration of the plan. And so we have this planning cycle where we spend a year or so talking to stakeholders, understanding how is the process, how is the plan working so far? For them, what do they need? Can we refine what we're modeling, change projects that we're looking at? And then we have a year or 2 of model improvements in order to continue building on the science and leverage new data sets that have become available over time. You know, now we are using a structure inventory of every building in the coastal zone of Louisiana And that was not possible back in 2012. But now with new data sets, we can get all of those structures as well as their attributes, like the first floor elevation, things that are critical for evaluating flood risk. This is just another view of how they think about iterative evaluation and changes to individual projects at the project level. But really, I want to give plenty of time for questions. So I think I intentionally made my slides a little bit shorter than the 15 minutes I was given, so people can jump in with whatever questions come up and what you're interested in the process. So with that, I just want to acknowledge that this is a huge effort. It is a large-scale planning process with a lot of different organizations involved here. But if anyone is looking for additional information, there is the website for the CPRA organization, and I'm certainly happy for anyone to reach out and be in touch if you're wanting to learn more beyond the time that we have here today.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. While we're making a transition here to Sheila, you might go ahead and answer this question that was directly sent to you about, does Indiana have an inland equivalent to Louisiana's CPRA? And is that DNR? So I don't know if you're able to answer that one while we get Sheila set up, and then I will introduce Sheila and tell you where we're going from here.
Yeah, I suspect others probably know better than I do kind of what Indiana's capacity for interagency coordination is. I know certainly there would be different priorities in Indiana compared to Louisiana. But as far as having an agency like CPRA that kind of reaches across the aisle and is just charged with working with other agencies in order to put this all together, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I'm not aware of one, but maybe others can chime in during the Q&A.
Sure, it sure sounds like a good model to follow. Well, we are going to have a Q&A here right after we wrap up with our last speaker, but I asked Sheila, who's been a long-term friend and colleague of mine, to join this because she's really great at kind of taking us to the practicalities of these things. And so we've talked about through here the challenges we're facing and some of the solutions and how they sit, but we also know that some of our Indiana communities are acknowledging those challenges and addressing them proactively or reactively and proactively sometimes. So with that, Sheila, would you like to share some of what's happening around the state that you see and are guiding, and maybe showcase some of our best practices here?
Absolutely. Great, thanks. Thanks, Jill. And thanks everyone else for joining. So there are a lot of good efforts being made throughout Indiana to try to mitigate and adapt to flooding and our changing climate conditions. And so what I'm going to do is highlight some of those. I mean, I could talk all day about all of them, but I'll hit the highlights and talk about some of those policy plans and projects that Indiana communities have been implementing. And then I'm going to frame that in the perspective of flood resilience planning, because I think that's a good way to discuss some of these projects and plans and policies. So flood resilience planning is the ability to prepare for, recover, and adapt to the changing flood events that we are seeing, those larger, more intense, more frequent events. And then what we want to do is really define flood resilience areas and then apply different strategies to those areas, so specific strategies for each area. And then all of this comes down to supporting the natural and beneficial function of the floodplain. So this whole idea of let's leave room for the river, let's let the floodplain provide the storage that it's meant to provide, and then let's let the floodway provide that conveyance that it's meant to provide. This approach is really a two-pronged approach. So you use land use planning policies to direct growth to outside of that floodplain area, so the area that's less vulnerable, the safer area. And what this really does is it stops the problem from getting worse. And then the second part is what Sivash was talking about, is finding these mitigation projects, or these plans that really protect those that are really suffering from flood, that are really vulnerable to flood risk. So we use the geographic regions of a river valley to define these different flood resilience planning areas. And so we have 6 of them The first one here is the river corridor. You can see my mouse here, my pointer. It's this blue area on the screen, and that is really the floodway. So this is important for conveyance of the river during a flood event. And this green line is the fluvial erosion hazard area, and that is the area that the stream needs to move as part of its natural process. So the river corridor area is defined as the floodway or the FEH, whichever is greater. The next area is this undeveloped high flood hazard storage area, the orange area here, and this is the undeveloped land in the floodway fringe. So this is the remaining part of that special flood hazard area or 1% annual chance. I'm not going to call it the 100-year, Dave. I won't do that to you. And then the next area is this moderate flood hazard area. This is the yellow. And so this is the 500-year or the 0.2%. And so this area isn't normally regulated. But what can we do to provide storage here for those really big extreme events? And then vulnerable developed areas, the red area here. So where do we have development that's currently in a floodplain or floodway, and and how do we put together practices and plans to really protect those people and lessen their pain and suffering? And then the area outside of the floodplain altogether is that safer area, and then the watershed as a whole. What practices can we look at in that entire drainage area? So let's talk about the first one, the river corridor impact area. So this is the floodway or the fluvial erosion hazard area, whichever is larger. And the whole idea here is to conserve land and prohibit development. So first off, you'd want to adopt a FEH regulation. So how do we prevent buildings, roads, infrastructure from being in this area? And then how do we conserve this land as undeveloped? We want to keep it with no disturbance at all. And that means even not even changing the grade of the land itself. And then Bob talked a lot about reconnecting the river to the floodplain. And so here's a great place where you can do that. You can restore eroded areas, and then that reconnection of the river to the floodplain. So here's an example from Morgan County. This is language they have in their flood ordinance for fluvial erosion hazard area. And so I'm going to just hit on a couple of these highlighted areas. So new primary buildings are not allowed to be constructed. Improvements to existing structures shall not decrease the distance between the existing structure and the top of bank. So you can't have anything any closer to the river. And you must comply with the compensatory flood storage. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. And then also this language says that you shall not increase the potential for fluvial erosion damage. So this is some good language that can be fairly easily added to the flood hazard ordinance. The second area is this undeveloped high hazard flood storage area. And so this is, remember that undeveloped open land in the special flood hazard area, or the floodway fringe. And we want to conserve land, and this is where we want to really maintain the natural beneficial function of the floodway fringe, provide a lot of storage. We want to discourage development as much as possible. So we want to conserve the land as undeveloped. So maybe that's parks, natural areas, agricultural areas. So that there's lots of ways that we can keep it as open space and still enjoy, and it can still be a functioning part of our community. Where development is unavoidable, we want to require compensatory storage. And then if it isn't an agricultural area, let's promote soil health and sustainability practices. So this is a great way to capture stormwater and floodwater. It really improves soil health and crop growth, and then also prevents the water from getting downstream and flooding areas. Here's an example of compensatory storage language from Noble County from their flood hazard ordinance. It says here the excavation volume shall be at least equal to the volume of storage lost. And this ratio is 1-to-1 due to fill or structure. So here you can see in this graphic that if you fill in an area for development, then you need to compensate, and ideally on that same piece of property or in proximity to where you're putting the fill in, to allow for that storage. And sometimes we'll see 1.5-to-1. We've seen it as great as 3-to-1. So it really just depends on the climate of your community and what your political will is there to maintain that compensatory flood storage. In that next area, the moderate flood hazard areas, so this is that 500-year or 0.2% annual chance. And so this is area that is subject to flood risk during those extreme flood events. And we want to provide additional storage here. And so we want to discourage new development as much as possible, and especially critical facilities, so nursing homes, police, fire, hospitals, those types of schools, those types of facilities. We want to make sure those are out of harm's way. And then in this area, you could require higher standards. So really taking the standards that you have for the 1% or your special flood hazard area and extending those into the 0.2% or that 500-year. So making sure buildings are elevated, access to buildings is elevated, really putting in higher standards in place. This next area is the vulnerable developed area. And so this is where we have people and buildings and facilities that are in the floodplain and that are experiencing flood losses and the impacts of flooding. So really this whole, all these strategies are really trying to reduce the pain and suffering of those folks. Participating in the National Flood Insurance Program Community Rating System. So this is a program that's voluntary. Communities can volunteer to participate in from FEMA. And the higher they go above the national standards, the lower their insurance premiums will be. So we have better flood risk and better protection for communities, and those people that are impacted and paying flood insurance, their premiums are less. We can retrofit buildings, we can relocate buildings here, and we can buy out structures. So really try to make sure the buildings are stronger or not in the flood hazard area at all. Bring non-conforming uses into compliance. So this image here on the side shows elevating these HVAC systems. So probably when this building was built, it wasn't required to have this elevated above the base flood elevation. And so in ordinances now it is. So bringing those into compliance, because that's one less thing that's going to be impacted from a flood and one less thing to be replaced after a flood. So FEMA has a sort of rule of thumb, every dollar spent on mitigation practices like elevating this HVAC system saves $7 in recovery. So that's a really good investment for community. We could have redevelopment practices, have them provide additional storage. So capture more stormwater and store more stormwater, or release it more slowly into the receiving water. We can prepare flood response plans and stormwater master plans. I'll talk a little bit more about those. Here's an example in Columbus, the city of Columbus, and they have it's their flood response plan. And so the image on the left of your screen shows these flood impact areas, and depending on the height of the river or the amount of flooding, these areas change from gray to yellow to orange to red, depending on the severity. It shows where roads are overtopped or impassable. It shows the shelters and whether those are open, or, for example, here, this high school would be compromised during this level of flood. And then the image to the right of that shows evacuation routes. So what roads do we expect to be open, and how are we going to move people either out of the community altogether in a flood or move them to those shelters? Stormwater master plan, this is from the city of Jeffersonville. They have a large flooding area here and a lot of structures here in red that are impacted by flooding. So the proposed strategy here is to put in a bypass channel. And so that would reduce the size of this floodplain and remove a lot of these structures from flooding. And then the city of Lafayette, Durkee's Run Stormwater Park. So this is a piece of property that flooded regularly, and so they've turned it into a park that is a beautiful amenity, and it still stores water during a flood event. So it has 11 rain gardens in it, has 6,400 square feet of permeable pavers. It's got this flood pressure wall that water squirts out of depending on the level of the water. And then this whole area here can flood. So it's functional during a flood, and it's functional it's for flood storage, and then it's functional not during a flood as an amphitheater. And then these safer areas. So how do we guide people to areas that aren't in the floodplain at all? So what practices can we put in our comprehensive plan, our zoning ordinance, our capital improvement plans, and how do we move growth and development to these safer areas? And then within these safer areas, let's promote low impact development and green infrastructure so we capture and store as much stormwater and floodwater as we can and not let it go downstream or into the waterways. And then this is a good place for critical facilities, of course. It's an example from the city of Hammond, how they require critical facilities to be located in the outside of the limits of the 500-year or 0.2% annual chance. They require the lowest floor to be elevated, and they also require the access roads, how you get to and from the structure, for that to be flood-free as well. And in the watershed, what practices can we do in the entire drainage area? How can we build partnerships within the watershed? How can we promote the use of cover crops and soil health? No adverse impact development standards so that one development is not adversely impacting another development. Regional detention facilities, and then the importance of our stream gauges as well. And then as part of that, there's these overall strategies. So these are to improve resiliency for the entire community. And so really syncing plans and policies and making sure there's consistency for resilience. So updating stormwater ordinances, making sure your comprehensive planning, your zoning ordinance have language in them that do allow or do protect the floodplains, but then also allow for native plants and don't require curb and gutters on all your streets so you can have green infrastructure practices. Making sure flood resilience is part of your capital projects, making sure you have a stormwater utility so you can pay for some of these projects, and then really communicating with the public and our elected officials about floods and flood risks. It's an example from Porter County where they have a tree replacement or a contribution to a tree fund policy. So this is all based on, there's a ratio here and it's tied to how big those trees are. So 1-to-1 replacement for a tree that's 5 inches to 16 inches and a 4-to-1 replacement for trees that are 30 inches. And then you could pay $200 per replacement tree, a maximum of $10,000 per project. So trees are really important stormwater best management practice, intercepting and uptaking a lot of stormwater. And then, since I wrap things up here, this is a report that came out just this year. It's called Adaptation for All, How to Build Flood Resilient Communities for All Sizes. And so it looks at land use policies and stormwater drainage, a lot of these practices we've just been talking about. And it looks at the cost, the range of costs. So less than 100,000 or 5 million or more. And then it also looks at the complexity. Is it low complexity or high complexity? So something like public outreach or participating in the community rating system, fairly low complexity and fairly low cost, as opposed to property acquisition and relocation. And the same for stormwater and drainage. So some of these green infrastructure practices, lower complexity and lower cost, as opposed to floodplain restoration or stormwater parks or daylighting streams. So with that, I'll happy to go into Q&A and answer any questions that folks have.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sheila. I realized in introducing you that I did not give any context for you being the Director of Planning at Christopher Burke, and your colleague Siavash was also joining us from Burke. So we appreciate how much you guys are doing with the communities, trying to come up with these locally led solutions. So that was a great round the room on a lot of different ideas and puts a lot of, I guess, control and solutions in local communities. I'm going to hop over and be watching a document we've created with some of your questions in it. So I'd just like to ask all the presenters to please go ahead and turn your cameras back on so we can have a little FaceTime with you guys and take some of the questions that we had. We did have that one for David just in between about whether Indiana had an equivalent agency. And I've seen some of our agency partners are already answering that in the chat and sending you to some really good links for permits related to these things. So I encourage you guys to check out the links in the chat as well. And thanks to agency folks that are on the line. So let's just see here. We had some questions earlier. This goes back to part one. If I understand correctly, federal agencies are now experimenting with the relocation of structures and residents in some locations. Is anybody, any considerations of doing that in Indiana? Is that happening? And what do we know about that as a strategy? Who could take that? Are we moving structures and people out of these areas in any active way?
Unfortunately not. I don't think it's as active. There's some things happening, but it's not as what we want to see. But we are hopeful that the agencies would, and with the communities and local communities and counties will start doing that. So hopefully.
Okay, thanks, Siavash. We had some questions earlier from that part one about, you know, bank stabilization and stream containment that's done by the Corps of Engineers, and some questions also about connecting streams and wetlands. So they're a little bit, I'm not sure the specific question there, but I did, as I looked at that, I did wonder, Bob, when you were talking about wetland loss and that one of the examples you gave us only had 25% of their floodplain connected. Can you guys talk about what would be an ideal situation with percent wetlands in a watershed or floodplains connected? Do we have, we know what we've lost and we have these terrible examples. Do we know what we're striving for by chance that would really help offset this?
I think I can give one good example that we used in the Central Till Plain, and each watershed is going to take a slightly different assessment and analysis to think about how many wetlands we need in there to start lowering that flood peak. We know in Eagle Creek watershed, when we did this work in 2013, we came up with a number of about 6% of the watershed in wetlands. Would allow us to start lowering that flood peak. It's a number that's very similar to some of the numbers that Don Hay got for the upper Mississippi. So I think somewhere in that range is where we're going to generally fall, but it's going to depend on the basin. It's going to depend on the soils and a lot of other aspects, but somewhere in there would be good. They frequently need to be in the headwaters, which is where we've lost a lot of them, because that way they slow the water before it comes down into the system. In places, Heather is wanting to know what the HUC is for Eagle Creek. I'd misspeak, Heather, I can't remember. I've not used that for some time. So, and we'll talk about it later, but the HUC for Eagle Creek is really funky. It's not the watershed we use. So regardless, when it comes to floodplains, we've done assessments on 2 different rivers so far: St. Joe of the East, so the Maumee St. Joe, and Little River. And in both cases, the amount of attached floodplain is hovering below 25% that we're seeing. So that's not what we'd like to see, particularly not with those northern rivers, because the central part of the state's going to be even more entrenched because they're runoff driven systems. Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work to do. So 25% is not the right number.
No, it's not the right number.
It's definitely where we have problems occur. Okay, I'm just moving through my question list from earlier. Bill had asked, I think, David, this is kind of aimed at you. Are protections and restoration measures for fisheries, shrimpers, et cetera, consistent with or different from protections and restoration measures for oil and gas infrastructure, like refineries or platforms? Is it compatible? And if not, please explain. If it's divergent, how are the priorities set between all these different interests? That's an interesting question to me too, because we do a lot of stakeholder outreach and we have a lot of users here in Indiana reliant on the water. How are all those interests balanced?
Yeah, certainly. This is a good example of some of the trade-off analysis that goes into the planning process. I would say it's a mix. Some things that are consistent and some things that are different across those industries. You know, the main priority is going to be providing flood protection to the communities that need access to the water, whether that's for fisheries or if it's for offshore drilling. We want to make sure that people's houses and the small businesses that support their communities are still protected as well. A lot of the large oil and gas facilities in Louisiana have their own site-specific hardening measures in place. And so they may not be in need as much of structural protection. They may already have a berm around their facility, for example, and may be more vulnerable to wind, actually. But the fisheries, here's an example where it's different. The fisheries are a lot more sensitive to changes in salinity. And so if you have a lot of river diversions in an area that would be feeding fresh water out into the Gulf or into the wetlands in order to rebuild land through sediment transfer, then that might be changing the habitat suitability for different fish or shrimp species or oysters. And so that's one of the examples that they talk about a lot when illustrating trade-offs, is that if you look at what you would do to optimize your planning process for like land loss prevention and flood risk reduction, you would do it differently depending on how many diversions you allow and how much you allow shrimp habitat to shrink. And so they had to iterate a little bit and kind of look at, well, what would happen? What would we select for projects if we prohibit diversions entirely? And then how much then are we giving up on the ability to prevent land loss or to, protect against flooding? So it's a balancing act for sure.
Yeah, certainly trade-offs we have to consider here. As I was listening to Sheila talk about getting agriculture involved in issues that are often seen as urban. So that's important to remember how many folks we have impacted by these things. I'm going to move, Sheila, I think some of these are coming your way. Bill was asking if the Morgan County approach is being used in other counties. Peg asked if we could put up your second to last slide once more regarding trees as mitigators. And then she has a question about if you can talk about the importance of trees and other plants to mitigating flooding. Is there any data that a neighborhood leader could use to document how much water the average tree absorbs? And if you can speak to plant use for mitigating erosion, examples around sediment bonds and such. So the role of trees and in mitigation, can you address that one for us?
Sure, yeah, there are some studies. I want to say it's something like 60 million gallons or something like that from a mature tree. It's really impressive what trees can do. It's something that I think we overlook. And there's so many ancillary benefits to trees too, but for stormwater management, they are pretty fantastic. So here's the slide here with that tree replacement. I hope that's one you're referring to. So it's in the Porter County, it's in their Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 5. So hopefully that, and they're, Porter County, good group of people, they'll certainly be able to answer questions of yours too. So regarding use of native plants, sure. I mean, they filter and trap sediments and pollutants. They should be everywhere, and make sure that your ordinance, your subdivision code and your zoning ordinance do allow native plants, that they're not considered weeds. So make sure that that language is in there, that if it is providing stormwater benefit, then it should be not mowed down or be a violation.
Okay, great. I'm going to have Scott drop something in the chat about, we have a tree pledge that'll give you some information on what a single tree can do. But let me have two more good questions here if we can sneak them in before our 1:30 time mark. Jennifer Tank's asking, first of all, thanks you all for your talks. I second that. But she's asking how much value could floodplain creation / restoration in upstream ditches or headwaters add to a watershed scale resilience, which kind of goes with another question we have about watershed management following this one. So example, could a 2-stage ditch be relevant? We often focus on the riverine floodplains to do their job, but there are lots of miles of waterway upstream that could be helping. Thoughts on managing more at the watershed level on some of these smaller streams? Any thoughts on that?
And absolutely. That's something that we always stress, is working in the headwaters what we can do, whatever we can do with the tributary streams and ditches, wetland creation in those areas, opening up, attaching some type of a bench to that channel, giving it some semblance of a floodplain. It's a critical piece to it. I think we look at the big downstream flood attachment because those are also places that we can do additional work. So it's all needed.
And a quick addition to that one here, absolutely. We know for some time that the flood storage is more effective when the stream is smaller.
Yes.
Due to the impacts there. So we need to start from upstream in terms of storage, and absolutely necessary.
Okay, thank you for those great last watershed comments. I feel like I teed you up then. That's my jam, so I'm excited to hear about that. Let me leave just with one overall question, because we're always trying to, as part of the Water Summit, this year we're going to be launching a working group to push towards solutions. We've talked a lot about them at the local level. Can we just go around the horn and tell me if there's any, like, the most important thing the state should be doing about flood resilience or planning, whether it's at the state level or it's a funding level, but what do you think the most important thing is? And then we will wrap up on that to-do list and let everyone get back to their Friday afternoon. Siavash, you want to give us a most important?
Yes, the funding is always good. Some funding help for communities to do resilience planning, in my opinion, is the most things to the biggest thing that moves the needle forward.
Thank you. Bob, one quick thing that would help the most?
I think the more land we can enroll in soil health practices, the better off we're going to be. It is our biggest sponge. It's our biggest opportunity.
Great. Yes, acreage-wise for sure. David, any thoughts here? One important action item?
Maybe looking for win-wins in other sectors as well. You know, thinking about bullshitting the argument for wetlands by knowing that if you're putting wetlands at the edge of fields, you might also be using it as a sink for nitrogen to improve water quality in addition to reducing flood.
Great, thank you. Sheila, one important action item for us.
Preserving the natural beneficial function of the floodplain. You can't recreate that.
Preserve the floodplain, protect the wetlands. These are all things we wildly support at the Alliance. Okay, with that, we had some questions about, we're out of time, but we had some questions about whether slides would be made available. So we will get back to you on that with a follow-up email, and also let you know where this recording will be posted in case you want to share it with any of your colleagues or public officials. If you need PDHs or those sorts of things, Scott's going to drop Brian Nielsen's email back in the chat for us, so you can reach out to him. He'll help facilitate that. And I will try to follow up on these last questions in the chat with you guys separately as well. So we will wrap this up with a follow-up email to you all. And just thank you so much for your interest in Indiana's waters and water planning, and for participating today. And we look forward to seeing you all at the summit. Thanks also to Purdue for co-hosting this with us. We'll see you at future events, and for sure September 7th and 8th at the Water Summit. Thank you, speakers. You guys have a great Friday.
Thank you, Jill.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.